My dad was an engineer, and my mother was interested in geology. And it's sort of the two of them sort of melded together. It wasn't really a positive choice that as a small boy I wanted to be a geological engineer or anything like that. It was, when I went to college, I went to college because that's what my family did. And there never was a question that I wouldn't or something. And what would I do? Well, I had no idea. I grew up in the Chicago area, and while I lived in the suburbs and was perfectly nice, Chicago was just an awful large city. And I really didn't care for big cities. So I started out at the University of Illinois, and I really didn't care for the courses I was getting, and I transferred to Missouri School of Mines. And when I got my degree in geological engineering, why, I decided I'd seen all of Chicago that I really wanted, so I packed up everything and left. Of course, the real truth is there that when I got out of college, the only thing I was really sure about, and not what I wanted to do, but I was sure about what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to work 8 to 5 in a big office. So while I was not really happy to be a rodman on a survey crew, it was certainly better than doing nothing. Now, as far as got into the oil field, it was sort of by mistake. After I left the survey crew, I went to work for a year as a mudlogger, just because it was the only job available. And it brought me from the Rocky Mountains down into Texas. And after a year of mudlogging, I really didn't want to stay with that, and I was offered a chance to go to work for Magabar, which was a drilling mud company. And since I had a minor in chemistry, why, drilling mud made a lot of sense to me. And I was happy with the freedom and stayed with the company for some 20 years. I didn't have much background in petroleum, but as I got into the work itself, out on the drilling rigs, you had to learn what you were doing, and questions came up, and it sort of was a postgraduate course in trying to figure out what in the world was going on out there and why it was. I first found out that I could make a difference in things when I was working in Colorado with some air drilling operations, and I wrote an article for one of the national oil field magazines about this subject of aerated mud, mostly because the editor had come to me and says, "Why don't you write this thing?" And so with his help we did, and I found out a couple of things that really amazed me. First, that the article was accepted in the industry, and it did make a difference. It pushed an industry technique that had been fallen into disuse and had not been followed up very well. I found out that, yes, I could write technical articles and derive equations and do all sorts of things like that. So, as I said, this first article in 1960 was a real revelation to me that, I could do something that really made a difference in the industry. When I did this first work and really did the first real research that I'd ever done, I realized that there was a lot of really brilliant information out there from some really brilliant people. And all I had to do was take it and make it work. So this was, again, the real hallelujah moment, in my life. I went in a year or so from being a guy that was drawing a salary to do a job that he liked doing, to somebody that said, wow, I can really do something here. I can make a difference in all of these things. And looking back now, some 50 years later at it, I said, still feel the same thrill I felt at the time that, gosh, I can really make a difference. I developed a well-controlled technique from reading pressures from logs. And when I got to South Louisiana, my management called me in one day and said, "Hey, we were having this problem out in the field there, and you're the guy, you're the technical guy that's supposed to solve it, so just go do it. And it had to do with some of the properties of our drilling mud. When you ran into high pressure zones, wells blew out. So the industry developed drilling muds, which were very heavy fluids, twice as heavy as water, sometimes 3 times as heavy as water, to hold these pressures in the earth. And for the most part, it worked out okay. The problem was that the heavier the fluid was, the more expensive it was, the more the chance was that it would be lost circulation. And it slowed the drilling process by 100% or more. Instead of drilling 100 feet an hour, you might be drilling 2 feet an hour, because the drilling fluid was too heavy. But the penalty of the well blowing out and burning up was also very high. And for some reason, after the war, in the late 40s and early 50s, this was just sort of accepted. But when I came into the industry in the late 50s, everybody was getting very concerned about it. So I looked at the subject and went back and did some research work and found out that the solution was already there. The giants I'd talked about, Goins and O'Brien with Gulf Oil Company and some people with City Service, had already worked the solutions out, and all I had to take the problem and make it practical solution. So from there on, for the next year, I got the tests done and sent back into me. All the math worked out with our little 6-inch slide rules. But I remember very clearly, and it was day before Christmas, the 23rd in December, and we had an engineer out on a rig call me in and say, hey, this well is trying to blow out. We have a well kick. And my wife has told me that I need to be in on Christmas Eve. And the tool pusher there said that his wife said he was going to divorce him if he stayed out over Christmas, because he stayed out over Christmas for the last several years. And with the techniques we were using at the time, it would take a week or so to kill one of these wells. Long story, but as the engineer asked me, this technique you were teaching us, will it work? And I said, well, of course it will work, So it was a classic case, and instead of taking a week to kill it, it just took 3 hours to finish the thing. And any resistance I had from the other engineers in the area disappeared that next week when the word got around that all of this thing worked. And from there we went on to a lot of work on reading well pressures from logs. At that time we had no idea how well pressures developed in the earth. But at a meeting, a fellow by the name of Harold Ham with Schlumberger in a meeting of the Well Log Association had said just casually that the major oil companies had noticed this relationship between what they call the short normal curve on an electric log and pressures, but that was an interesting relationship. Well, as soon as I got out of the meeting, I raced down to the log library and bought some electric logs and hung them up over a door. And I looked at this log and, gosh, that relationship was there. It was really clear. Why didn't anybody else see it? So I quickly got our old blue mimeograph machine, if you remember those things, and mimeographed off some of these logs and wrote out a little test and sent it out to all of our engineers and said, look here, guys, look what we can do. And I was just as excited about it then as I am now. Look what we can do. And we can actually take these little wiggly lines on a piece of paper and tell what the pressure is down at 10,000 feet in the earth. And the guys all said, well, he was right on the other one, so maybe he's right on this one. And it wasn't a month later that somebody called in from offshore and said, well, I'm out here and we're not drilling very fast, and the electric log says our mud weight is too heavy. And can I cut it back? I said, look, you know, I'm in bed on shore in Lafayette, Louisiana. You're 10 miles offshore and there's a wind blowing and there's big waves. Now, if you think you can do that without blowing this well out, why, just go have at it. Well, he said, I'm pretty desperate. So, but he was, so he did it. And it worked, just like the book said it did. And so that worked great. And again, another great ego ride, but it was all work done by other people. It was, all I did was hang the log over the wall, over the door, and say, wow, look at that thing, and draw a red line down it. And then later, some Shell researchers, Jim Jordan and Shirley, wrote a paper about drilling rate they called a D-exponent. And they said this is an interesting concept that we can measure formation pressure by how fast you drill, but it doesn't work. I read the paper and said, well, yeah, the reason it didn't work is because the data they took wasn't any good. So we went out on the drilling rig and took some data, and lo and behold, it worked. I mean, it was wonderful. So now all of a sudden, we knew how to kill wells when they blew out. We knew how to measure what the pressures ought to be from previous electric logs. And now in real time, while we were doing it, we could read these pressures. This was a real revelation. I mean, this is a real major change in the whole thing. And what it needed a champion to kick it off and force it. And once it was kicked off, and once the people in the field were reporting this works, then it had to be accepted. And of course, it's gone on to be a major industry of its own now. The thing that impacts everybody the most right now, and probably is one of the really, really big changes, is not so much the horizontal drilling, but the idea that you can produce oil and gas from shale. Now, we've known for 150 years that shale was the source of oil and gas. And shale is probably the most dominant formation on land and in the ocean edges that we have. But we know that's the source of the oil and gas. We've known that. And we've also known that we found it in the sandstones because they were traps. We knew these things. But so we went and we found the oil that was in the traps because it was pretty easy. Now, nobody really much analyzed all of this except some of the university types and some of the U.S. Geological Survey types that had written early papers from the early 20s on about all of these subjects. But we didn't grasp it in the oil field until we got to drilling into the shale. George Mitchell was the real hero in this. He realized that shale was the source of oil and gas. And he pushed it. And he pushed it just far enough and the horizontal drilling techniques came in, which is essential to it. And some of the fracturing techniques all came in. But George Mitchell pushed this idea to where we all had to accept it. Everybody rejected it, except Mitchell. But he proved a point, and this has been the big, probably in the last 50 years, a really big impact on this sort of thing. The big impact in the 50s and 60s and 70s was offshore drilling because that's where so much oil and gas came from. But the big impact here in this, in 2000 has been the shale drilling because it's put us back as a energy producer again. And it is really, technically, it's fantastic. Geologically, it's unbelievable. all of the technologies have come together, the seismic interpretation, the geology, the chemistry, the origins of the shale. All of a sudden, all of these theoretical values are important. What did the geologist bring to this before? Well, he thought that there was a trap down there. But now the geology explains to you whether when you drill this well, you're going to get oil or you're going to get gas or you're going to get a mixture. And if gas is selling at a cheap price and oil is selling at a high price, obviously you want to drill the well where you'll get oil instead of where you get gas. So this has been the real game changer in this decade. I have a very biased view of what the biggest challenge to the industry is. And this is based on my own background. I think the biggest problem that the industry has right now is the engineers that are writing the plans and setting up the operations have no experience in actual operations. So there's a big disconnect between the operating man on the rig and the man who's paying the bill, so to speak. The engineer represents the major oil company or the independent. And he is the man that's writing the rules and setting the rules and writing the contract. But he has no real first-hand knowledge of what actually is happening out here. We used to have that. We used to have training periods lasting 4 and 5 years for men and women coming out of college to bring them up through the ranks. So now we have this disconnect that we've always had in Europe, and we certainly have in Asia, that the man making the rules for the game doesn't know how the game is played. In some cases it works out okay, but it's a real challenge because in so many of the wells, we're pushing the limits. Now, the limit may be mechanical about drilling 10 miles out under the ocean, or the rules may be that, or the limit may just be that we only got $900,000 to drill and complete this well. So, but the guy that's making the rules about this has never played the game. You're floating out on an ocean, and this machine is costing you $5 million a day, direct and support costs, and you can figure what that is per minute. And the guy in charge of it has never done any of this. And the guy that's calling the shots is in an air-conditioned Houston office, and he works 8 to 5. But this thing off the coast of Sumatra is in 900 feet of water, and it's working 24 hours a day, and there's a typhoon coming. What are you going to do? Who's going to make the decision? Well, I don't think that's a good sustainable practice. The solution is really difficult. The solution is you got to train this guy over here first. I think I worked in the petroleum industry just simply because I found something that gave me the freedom, the minute freedom to make my own decisions. And I say it, I have this really bad bias about big organizations and big offices. And it's just a personal thing with me. But where I was working, I had all sorts of freedom, whether I wanted to work at 8 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock at night or midnight or anything. It didn't make any difference. Nobody cared. Just me. I did it. As long as I did it, that was all that was important. So in my own personal thing is a very personal thing. I guess I pursued things that I liked to do. It was something that was a big challenge every day, and something that I enjoyed doing, and something where I had a lot of freedom to pick my way and pick my time and pick my way or process of doing things. It was those moments when you had that real hallelujah moment. Damn, this worked. Everybody said it wouldn't go. It worked. You know, it not only worked, it worked the way it was supposed to do, and there was maybe 5 or 6 times like that in industry, and when these things all came together at that particular moment where you said, wow, it wasn't Christmas bonuses or anything like that. It's industry-wise, it was sort of like having the birth of a baby. All of a sudden, wow, all of this stuff came together. And just, I can still get excited about it. I still remember how I felt when the guy called in and said, okay, now we got it going the way it should go. So, and it had to do with well control and pressures in the earth and some of this horizontal drilling and directional drilling. All of these had a moment or so like that where, it all came together and it all worked the way it was supposed to work. And of course, then there were lots of other times when it didn't work so well, but when you look back, you remember the really good ones.